Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and tell us what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. And subscribe, so you'll be here when the next story wakes. Now, let's begin. I never planned to end up there, those places America leaves on the side of the map, halfway forgotten, halfway waiting, where the lights feel a little too far apart and the night carries stories nobody volunteers to tell. My name is Adam, and I was 22 the fall I moved into that sagging 3-bedroom on Oakview, a rent-split decision born of final stress and the practical arithmetic of student life. Ann Arbor felt like a small city with big doors then, late-night diners, fluorescent-lit libraries, freedom packaged in coffee shop napkin plans. I picked the house because it was a block from South State and because Kyle, the boy who answered my roommate ad, promised cheap coffee and an easy laugh. Megan answered the other half of the ad with a yoga mat slung over her shoulder and a soft, impatient kindness that made neighborhood cats bristle toward her porch. We were good roommates in the way people are good when they're young and have too little to lose. We shared chores and playlists and the joint horror of broken boilers in November. We were also the kind of people who took pictures of everything: welcome week murals, pizza boxes in the living room, the ridiculous thrift store find that somehow looked like a coat from a decade too cool for us, because cameras are the way we certify memory now. We strung the first set of prints along the hallway with the cheap white clips Kyle swore by, little sparks of our new, temporary family. Cheap ink on cheaper paper. The photos made the long corridor feel lived in, softened the tan walls. At first, the presence in the middle was something I could mislabel with any number of reasonable excuses: a printing smear, an overexposed reflection, a stranger stopped mid-step in the background of a shot. But the same shape kept showing up, not always in the exact same position, but always in that center of frame where a person would naturally try to squeeze in to belong. Tall, broader in the shoulders than any of us. A suggestion of a head tilted like someone listening. It was a blur that wanted to become a face, a space insisting on occupancy. The first time I pointed it out we laughed. Jokes work the way bandages do, they keep bleeding from being looked at too long. Fourth roommate, Kyle said. He pays in oven-baked sadness. Megan made a joke about ancestral renters. We pretended to be amused because pretending is how you keep a house from tipping into the uncomfortable. But laughter is a thin heat when the world around it is cold. Small things began to rearrange themselves like the edges of a puzzle we hadn't noticed. Photos we had taken together and sworn were exact memories gained an extra shoulder in the background overnight. A Polaroid from a party downtown, 3 faces in the foreground, the mural smeared neon behind us, had, when I checked it one afternoon, a figure crouched in the doorway 8 degrees off from where anyone could have stood. Once you begin to notice a pattern, your eyes take the shortcut of seeing it everywhere, and validation becomes a slow contagion. I started to find the figure in different media, in the smear of the TV screen when the set was off, caught in the half-gloss of a coffee shop window, tucked into the reflective corner of a friend's sunglasses. It wasn't always crisp enough to be a portrait, it was a presence that left sugared outlines and asked my mind to refuse closure. The first time it stopped being something we could banter about was a rainy Tuesday in late October. Kyle had gone to pick up new bulbs for the string lights because he decided mood lighting solves almost everything, and Megan had a late tutoring shift. I had the house to myself and the kind of insomnia that makes a person do delicate, foolish things, like checking a photo one more time. I took down the biggest print, the Welcome Week mural, because it was the one that teased harder than the others. Up close, the blur wasn't just ink running out. It had the texture of intention. The printer had smeared in a way that suggested features trying and failing to resolve, like someone had tried to teach a photocopier how to remember a face. I stared until the hallway blurred and the lights hummed like a chorus of small insects. The house, in that way an old wooden thing does, seemed to breathe with me, pipes settling, heat kicking in, the distant neighbor upstairs stumbling through a nightmare of their own. The image felt almost alive, patient in a way that made my skin crawl. After that, the house began to produce evidence I couldn't easily file under coincidence. My phone buzzed one night with a new camera image saved at 3:13 a.m., an automatic photograph taken from my own bedroom doorway. It was me, asleep, the covers clutched. In the dark doorway stood the outline he'd been making in other media, tall, patient, the head slightly cocked as though listening for a pulse. You learn quickly that timestamps are not comfort, they are cruel facts. I checked the clock. 3:16 a.m., I checked the footage from the little Wi-Fi camera Kyle had shoved into the living room after some petty theft reports on our block. The playback was the boring kind of evidence, hours of static, no entries, no exits. But when you scrub carefully enough, the world begins to show you frames that feel like bad decisions. At 3:13 there was a frame with a vertical smear at the doorway, a ghost of something that existed in the gap between pixels and my ability to ignore it. I left that morning in a near panic, stuffing belongings into my trunk with hands that trembled too much to be dignified. I told myself I'd come back in daylight, I told myself I would call the landlord and have a rational adult extract whatever prankster or algorithm had chosen our lives for their experiment. From Packard to the interstate I tried to name every reasonable cause. The landlord was practical in the way cheap landlords are, old houses play tricks. He said, as if that meant something less active than our experience. Campus security was patient, they did walkthroughs, took notes, smiled at our nervous energy like a kindly dog that takes food it is not meant to. They found nothing, and still, messages began to beep with evidence. A photo from Kyle that showed the foyer empty except for a longitudinal darkness where a person might stand if a house could place someone carefully and leave them there like a caution sign. I began to notice details that were never there before, smears on the windowsills at the exact height of a shoulder, a faint outline on the living room carpet where furrows suggested more than a dropped blanket. The house was collecting the shape of a person for us. When you're young enough for rent split logic but old enough to not want to look like you're hysterical, you gather courage in tiny ways. I snuck back one night with a friend who was half railroaded into being my moral support, and stood in the hallway until the lamp burned my eyes. The mural print, the original, a thing I had taped there with my own hands in a stupid, naive ceremony, had been turned face down. Nobody turns a photograph face down absent intent. I turned it back, and the thought occurred to me that perhaps what we were dealing with wasn't ephemeral, not exactly. It had a habit of ensuring the center of things remained occupied, it had patience the way a tide does. The house began to creep into memory. If you showed me a corner of the living room now, I would find a way to see that smear at its center. The uncanny taught me to catalog, photos with unsourced edits, EXIF data showing a device or an editor with no name, files created at hours none of us were awake. I tried, in those days, to make sense of it as technology. Some collage app that stitched faces out of the cloud, image meta fraud, deepfake light. But the thing with technology explanations is that they don't account for weight. For how your hands shake when you pick up a photo you remember taking but which, when you study it, contains an added body in the doorway. The human brain has a generosity for pattern recognition that is also its liability, it can turn static into meaning. But the other evidence, security footage with a single frame of distortion, early morning photographs saved to 3 different phones at the same impossible time, began to make the entertainment of rationalism thin. We tried making jokes to survive the thinning, we named him Henry once, passing the name like a beanbag until the lightness of laughter frayed. The house did not respond to names, if anything, it rearranged. One of the stranger escalations occurred when photos began to show not just a figure but the way people looked at it. A picture from a party on Main Street, a candid we were proud of because my friend Sam had managed to get everyone on camera, had an extra set of eyes in the shot, and those eyes, while essentially blotted out of detail, seemed aimed at the camera with an intimacy that made the paper itch. After that, dreams followed suit. They were not cinematic or even especially coherent, they were accumulations of small observations, the way the smear of paint looked on a telephone pole at midnight, the sense of pressure on the edge of sleep like someone standing over a child and waiting for the breath to stop. Therapy, to my modern credit, is a place I tried. My therapist met me with the same patient neutrality the universe had been dishing out. Stress-related phenomena, he offered, leaning on a taxonomy that felt sterile and smart in print. He suggested sleep hygiene, reduced caffeine, more daylight. He listened and offered vocabulary. Language is useful until you need it to hold an experience like a living object, a thing that moves. There is also a polite way adults have of telling you that when your life is defined by late nights, your mind will invent company. I wanted to argue, I wanted to hand him a row of prints and say, see, this is not invention. But the truth of the matter is that no matter how many professionals you consult, or how many police officers make notes, it only becomes real in the way that matters to you, the way it rearranges your attention, the way it stops you from walking calmly to the bathroom at night. The real break came when the phenomenon stopped being an observer in pictures and became a participant in our lives' rhythm. I remember the precise sound, which is ridiculous, because memory rarely gifts you precision. It was the quiet click of a camera shutter at the lowest possible volume, the sort of tiny mechanical whisper that means someone tried to record something without waking anyone. I lay in bed, breath shallow, and felt the air in my room slide where a shadow might pass. The next morning the camera app was open on my phone to a photograph taken at 3:11 a.m., me on my side, covers pushed down, the doorway behind me a darker rectangle, and there it was again, centered in that darker field, closer now by a small but unmistakable degree, as if whatever it had been learning to do involved rehearsing proximity. We attempted to force the issue like people who think action solves metaphysical problems: more lighting, less isolation, constant occupancy during the nights. We slept in rotations, all of us on couches in the living room like a depressed, poorly budgeted commune. None of it worked, because the presence didn't need entry so much as an invitation in the shape of attention. The evening it escalated to an unbearable clarity. Kyle stood with me in the hallway and said, "We need to document it ourselves. No prints, no phone filters, raw, continuous video." He set up his camera with a diligence that read like a little man's attempt at scripture. We recorded for 12 hours. The playback was miserable in its ordinariness: bowls of cereal, the hiss of tea, a spider that frequented the same corner for reasons of dignity. There was a frame at 3:13 that held a vertical distortion, the film's grain doing what grain does when it wants to be honest. It refused to invent detail and so left a blank that had the gravity of the figure's absence. I left the house not because I had proof for anyone else, but because I couldn't bear the way the center of all things had been occupied. It felt like a violation of a spatial promise we make to ourselves when we live under one roof. A home should be predictable to the degree that you can take little comforts for granted. When that is gone, the world becomes a place you walk through with the knowledge that someone could be fitting themselves into the frames you will one day make of your life. After I left, the messages kept coming: a photo at 2:58 a.m., a clip with a smear, Megan's text, a single screenshot of the hallway with the mural print face down. "We flipped it back," she wrote later, in a message that smelled of too late bravery. "Now it's back on the wall." Sometimes leaving does not expel the thing, it deposits it in the context of your absence. Months later, in an apartment 3 towns over with newer tile and the kind of landlord who forgets your name, I still find myself careful with photographs. I arrange them along mantels and in frames with a light that is both protective and defiant. Once, at a friend's 4th of July barbecue, I took a picture and for a breath I saw a hint of that same smear in the background, near the threshold of a doorway that wasn't ours. I deleted the file before the napkin I used to wipe my hands could smudge the screen. Sometimes I tell myself the whole thing was a group psychosis, the shared, elaborate hallucination of 3 tired minds. I like that explanation because it keeps me in control. But other nights, when the radiator clicks and the city outside hums like an animal too large for the block, I turn on the hallway light and leave it burning for a little longer than seems rational. It is a small mercy. At the center of any photograph we take now, I want the light to be the first thing to meet it, to see the middle of the frame and refuse it the patience it once had. This is the story I carry, the one that begins with cheap clips and ends with a person-shaped absence that taught me how thin the membrane of my certainties was. It's not a tidy narrative, it has no courtroom, no final explanation. It has instead small, indelible facts, timestamps that shouldn't exist, photos saved without recollection, the sensation of being observed by a presence that did not look like a person and yet organized itself in the centers where people are meant to stand. If you're sitting there in your own kitchen, or in some rented hallway lined with your own clipped lives, consider where your frames might be stitched to remember you. Consider what it means if the middle of a photograph insists on occupation long after you have packed your boxes. I never planned to end up there, those places America leaves on the side of the map, halfway forgotten, halfway waiting, where the lights feel a little too far apart and the night carries stories nobody volunteers to tell. My name is Adam, and the second story I have for you comes from the same worn-out college logic that makes a person accept a stranger's name on a lease and call it fate. This one began with a Craigslist post, a cramped second-floor apartment above a laundromat on the edge of Cincinnati's Over the Rhine, and a man named Dylan who smiled too easily and refused to be in photographs. If the first story was about a presence that staged itself into our pictures, this one is about someone who refused every frame he might have belonged to, and how that refusal becomes something hungrier than mere absence. It started in winter when the city felt like a tin can rattled by passing trucks, and it spiraled into that particular kind of small-room paranoia you get when the house you pay for begins to keep score. I found the ad between shifts, cheap rent, utilities included, available immediately. The place was a two-bedroom with a window that looked down onto a blinking neon laundromat sign that hummed at all hours. Dylan met me at a coffee shop 2 blocks away, wore a thrift store coat that somehow made him look both careful and like he had something to hide. He said he worked nights sometimes, he said he liked quiet, he said he'd been living in the city for years. He spoke in the kind of sentences that made you feel like you were finishing him off. It made the offer feel tidy and safe. When he moved in, it was the pragmatic kind of arrangement that students make: split the utilities, don't touch each other's food, be quiet when someone's on a graveyard shift. On paper it was unremarkable. In practice, it felt like stepping into a house that had already decided who it would keep. The first oddity was small and laughable, which is always the worst kind of beginning. At a welcome get-together I hosted, pizza, cheap beer, low-stakes conversation, someone suggested a group photo, one of those impulsive, blurry captures you scroll past later and call nostalgia. Dylan refused to be in the picture. Not with the casual, "Nah, I look bad," everyone says. He stepped out of frame so briskly the camera nearly snapped without him. Later, as people scrolled and tagged each other on social feeds, I noticed he had a talent for erasing himself from any image. In photos where he was definitely present, placing his mug on the table, talking to a friend, he'd appear only as a smear at the edge, or the shadow of a shoulder, or not at all. At first we joked, we made up explanations. He had a bad side, he valued privacy, he disliked being documented. Jokes, like bandages, are made to cover raw things, they do not heal. The apartment itself was narrow, kitchen, couch, 2 doors down a short hall. Dylan's room had a small window that framed the laundromat's neon, and his door was always shut with a gentle, stubborn hush. He kept to himself, true to his word, leaving at odd hours and returning at odd hours. Sometimes we'd assume he'd gone to a late shift at the diner, sometimes to a gig, sometimes to nowhere we could easily track. He never plugged his phone into communal outlets, and once I went to text him about a cable bill the number bounced. When I asked him casually about it, he smiled and said he liked to manage things manually, as if that solved the riddle of his digital absence. It was strange, in a small way that makes your chest clench, and like all strange, small things it grew roots. The pattern hardened when photographs began to appear in my phone that I did not remember taking. I am someone who takes pictures compulsively: the city at dawn, the cheap slice of pizza someone recommended, the way fluorescent light kisses a commuter's face. But these images were different. One morning I woke to a new photo saved at 3:11 a.m., my bedroom from the doorway, the city glow behind the blinds, me curled under my blankets. Standing by the foot of the bed, barely there, was a figure that matched the blur I'd seen in other people's pictures. If you squinted it became a man, tall, profile turned slightly as if listening. The timestamp and the camera's open app status told me the phone hadn't been used by me. I had no memory of opening the camera that late, and I knew I hadn't walked in my sleep. The same wrenched feeling I'd had at the house on Oakview trickled through me again, an image that rearranges the edges of your confidence, a timestamp that accuses. When confronted, Dylan's expression shifted in a way that made me feel I'd suddenly asked the wrong question. He said, flat and quiet, "You shouldn't look so closely. Some things don't like to be looked at." I tried to file his words under a catalog of explanations: ease of speech, deflection, personality quirk, but they lodged like a hook. People who hide aren't always hiding from the world, sometimes they are hiding the world from themselves. After that, other things that had been easily brushed aside began acquiring weight. I started noticing the way lights in the apartment flickered when he walked past, even when the bulbs were new and the wires had been checked. I noticed the thermostat registering dips in temperature when he was home, like a localized cold spot that hovered for an hour and then drifted away. I noticed that certain noises shifted, the fridge hummed in a different register, a clock gained a new, hollow beat. Those were small sensory things you can rationalize until you can't. By the time I realized my own breath sounded different inside our apartment, shorter, more ready, I had already admitted to myself that the pattern had teeth. The night it crossed into something more tangible and less dismissible was unremarkable by ordinary measures: rain, a late shift call-in at the diner that left the apartment quiet, a neighbor's television murmuring through thin walls. I had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV playing something I don't remember, static helps a mind sleep, and woken up to the sound of the front door opening with the faint, practiced tread of someone who thinks their steps mean nothing. I kept my eyes closed, lying still like a person pretending they are unafraid so they can assess the next move without signaling. There was the softest of clicks, like a camera shutter barely audible through fabric. For a moment I lay there in a way that felt measured, cataloging what moved and what didn't. The room felt like a stage in a rehearsal where some actor had taken their place in the dark. My phone, face down on the coffee table, buzzed and notified me of a new image saved at 3:13 a.m. I didn't want to look, but I did. It was my bedroom again. The doorway held a vertical absence that the camera refused to render. The absence had the weight and posture of a person. When I confronted Dylan directly, the conversation was a study in small things becoming instruments. He looked at me the way a man looks at a ledger with numbers he doesn't recognize, calm and faintly annoyed that I had disrupted the balance. "You should stop saving everything," he said, voice flat. "People want to be private." There was something in his tone that suggested he was telling me something true and also something dangerous, the difference between privacy and secrecy. The distinction matters, because where privacy is a boundary you choose, secrecy is a thing that chooses you. After that exchange, I began to notice other people's photos in a new register. If you scanned a group image long enough and with the right amount of shame, you could find the edge where someone's face had been ruthlessly omitted or smudged by a compression error. That compression looked less like technology and more like intent. I tried to use the tools of our world against what I couldn't name. I set up a spare camera in the hallway we shared, cheap but serviceable, with motion alerts that pinged my phone. Dylan seemed unconcerned, maybe because he thought he would be cleverer than an app, or because he believed something older than cameras was on his side. For 3 nights the camera recorded nothing but us being ordinary: coffee, early classes, use of the communal sink. Then, at 3:13 a.m. on the 4th night, the motion detector caught a small change in the doorway, a smear of pixels that escaped the camera's attempt to make sense of it. There was a single frame where the doorway registered as darker than it should have been, a negative space that read like a human outline but refused to focus. When I slowed the footage, my stomach dropped the length of an elevator. The smear had a posture, the suggestion of a head cocked like someone who listens for the rhythm of breathing. We watched it over and over until repetition turned observation numb. What I did next is the thing people do when they are afraid but still hungry for control. I confronted Dylan with the footage at 3 in the afternoon, in the bright, indignant light of the living room, as if daylight could anchor evidence in the world the way it anchors dust motes. He listened, hands folded, then said the phrase that changed the geometry of the apartment for me: "Some things don't want to be captured clearly. You record them, they respond. You stop recording, they stay." He made it casual, as if he were discussing seasons. If I had to choose a single sentinel moment, it was this: the realization that attention can be the currency with which these things, whatever they are, trade their presence. In a house where someone refuses frames and yet appears in the margins of others, your own eyes become the signal that calls them closer. After that exchange, the apartment took on a rhythm of its own. Dylan's times in and out became less random in the sense of pattern and more like the measured intervals of a pit watch, as if he marked time against something the rest of us couldn't name. We began to sprout small rituals, leaving lights on in clusters, moving to different rooms to avoid sleep in the same space, not pointing cameras toward doorways. But rituals are poor weapons against patient things. They can delay, they can redistribute anxiety, but they rarely remove the cause. Once, on a night too cold even for trucks to rattle past, I woke to the sensation of being watched from somewhere very close. My phone screen, sitting face up on the coffee table, had a new photo, a close-up of my face from the chest up, taken from a low angle, the timestamp 2:57 a.m. I was still in bed in the next room. I had not left the house. The app's file data showed the camera remote had been activated, the shutter tripped, a small mechanical act that is neutral in principle and devastating in composition. The face in the photo was mine but different, eyes wide, expression slack in sleep, the kind of vulnerability you do not borrow gladly. There is an unglamorous courage required to be practical about hallucination, if it is that, and courage is what we tried to manufacture. We reached out to the landlord, who was brisk and polite and had the kind of cheap empathy that shows up in emails, and he insisted there were no hidden cameras and offered in a tone of explanation that sometimes, vacant items, get tossed into rooms when people move out. We called campus security and they wrote up an incident report and said they would keep an eye on the property. But institutional response runs on a different clock than personal terror. And it never quite catches the immediacy of a midnight image that alters your sense of personal geography. I thought about leaving. In truth, I did leave for a week to couch surf with a friend across the river. Distance is a temporary salve, though, the kind of decision that feels brave in the moment often only stretches the problem out until it finds you again. When I got back, Dylan had packed without fanfare and left a note folded into a book on the kitchen table. It was the sort of note that could have been written by someone with a habit of being tidy and polite. Sorry for the inconvenience, needed to go, take care. The ambiguity of the message swallowed me. Did he leave because he was scared? Did he leave because he was what invoked the fear? Did he go because he was fleeing or because he was exactly what we were frightened of? Those questions are the kind that spin you in circles, because they are all true at once in the way they apply. I pulled up his contact on my phone. The number was gone. His social profiles, which had been thin beans of identity, evaporated like breath on chilled glass. The apartment felt both hugely empty and irritatingly occupied after he left, like the residue of a ghost that tidy men carry with their things when they move. I thought that might be the end. Closure is a fragile thing and a cliché people cling to because it comforts the mind. For a month or so life read as functional, classes, cheap coffee, laundromat cycles. Then a photo arrived on my phone with no sender, saved at 3:13 a.m., the living room couch, empty, the blinds at half-mast, daylight bleeding softly into the frame, and in the far corner, where the hallway led to the bedrooms, a vertical suggestion of a person standing perfectly at the threshold. Not a smear this time, an outline with a small, deliberate clarity. It was standing in the exact place Dylan had stood in the footage nights before. As if the apartment was offering up a last proof that some spaces can keep memory, as if memory were a sticky thing that collects more dust as years pass. I stared at the image until my eyes burned. There are nights when I doubt the reliability of the world, and there are nights when doubt turns into something like worship, a verb of repeated practices, lights on at odd hours, cameras placed in corners like modern talismans, doors left unlocked so that whatever needs to leave is less tempted to stay. I am telling you this because there is a special kind of horror that is quieter than thunder, the knowledge that the frame you build around your life can be intruded upon by a person who refuses frames. If a figure refuses to be photographed yet shows up in your margins, it forces a reckoning you never asked for. It asks, what portion of your life do you allow to be private, and what portion do you allow to be secret? There is no clean answer because both privacy and secrecy require boundaries, and boundaries are what these presences tend to rearrange. Tonight, if you go to your own apartment and look at the places where your life is audienced, photos on mantels, frames on walls, posts that collect other people's attention, consider the edges. Consider what it would feel like to see something decide the center for itself. Consider the peculiar arrogance of a thing that refuses a frame but still stands where frames belong, measuring the space with a patience that goes on beyond departure. There are no final scenes here, no bright resolutions, there is only the ongoing work of noticing and choosing how much of yourself you keep lit. For us, the aftermath has been learning to carry redundancy, 2 cameras instead of 1, the habit of checking doorways before sleep, the habit of naming nights when the city hums like an animal in heat. These are small, inadequate things, but they are human, and sometimes being human is about how stubbornly you insist on ordinary measures in the face of the extraordinary. If you like to imagine a clean ending, I won't give you one. I will give you the facts I have, timestamps that can't be explained away, footage that refuses to render detail cleanly, a roommate who erases himself from pictures and a presence that prefers the shadows where people should stand. I will give you the memory of the note left on our kitchen table and the sudden emptiness that followed it like the hush after a train disappears into a tunnel. I will give you the new photos that appear on my phone while I am awake, pictures of rooms that I know and love, with a central darkness planted deliberately in the doorway as if to remind me that in the spaces we share, attention has weight. And I will give you this last loneliness, that the thing most frightening about Dylan was not that he vanished but that his refusal to be framed taught whatever follows him how to take a stance in the exact place people expect to be safe. Some nights in American college towns smell like rain on hot asphalt and the faint exhaust of buses, that never quite stop for anyone, and those nights make ordinary rooms feel thinner at the edges. My name is Adam, and in March of my 23rd year I learned what it meant for a room to keep breathing after the people who lived in it had left. The apartment was a tired 3-bedroom above a closed bakery on the edge of a neighborhood that still had original brick and one diner that never stopped serving eggs, and I kept it because the rent was merciful, and because I convinced myself the kind of roommates who would move in with me would want bills split and quiet hours respected. The ad I posted was careful, no parties, respectful of space, fluorescent light okay only in emergencies, and the man who answered it called the same evening, voice steady like someone who'd practiced calm, and came that weekend with 2 suitcases and a smile that managed to be both polite and very close to absent. He said his name was Ethan when I handed him the lease, but the way his eyes avoided the framed photos on my wall made me think he was practicing a different vocabulary. He took the small room at the rear that opened onto the alley and complained about nothing and seemed to accept the closet's tendency to stick, as if he'd lived in worse places and learned how to perform contentment as a survival skill. We traded the obligatory roommate meeting fine print, when to do dishes, who would take out trash, and slid into the same domestic choreography so many of us do, shared groceries, a single cheap vacuum that lived by the door, the unspoken rule that late-night study sessions have a soft, non-judgmental volume. For the first week it was that kind of ordinary, the little rituals knitting together into a usefulness that felt safer than being alone. Ethan kept to himself, returned late, left early, and the building made its usual noises. Pipes, the neighbor's cheap television, the occasional cat on the fire escape, but I noticed a different rhythm that I couldn't place, a sabacua of sound like someone breathing through cotton, and I chalked it up to fatigue until it became impossible to chalk anything up anymore. The first time the apartment told me it had a history that wasn't mine, it did so with a small, insinuating theft, my cereal box missing from the pantry and a folded baseball cap laid flat on the kitchen table where no one in our building wore hats inside. I came home tired from closing at the diner, and the cap was there, slightly damp from the drizzle that had come in that afternoon, as if someone had paused on their way through and left a footprint of routine behind. I asked Ethan the next morning and he blinked like he had been asked whether the moon was in orbit. "Must be the wind," he said, and then, softer, as if confiding, or a previous tenant. That answer did more than keep me from insisting on a polite search, it left me with the thought that rooms accumulate habit the way basements collect damp, slow, nearly invisible, and impossible to air out with the swish of a broom. A few days later, I found the closet slightly ajar at noon, sunlight slicing a knife of brightness into a place that otherwise collected shadows, and the feeling in my chest tightened into the small animal fear you get when you realize you have agreed to live inside someone else's past. The noises began to change their grammar at night. Old buildings have a vocabulary of settling, pops, groans, the sympathetic shudder of a radiator waking, but there was a new sentence forming under those old words. The vents would whisper as if wind were conversing with the floorboards, the baseboard near Ethan's wall would emit a slow click that matched, somehow, the tempo of a spoken word. Someone, or something, moved with a deliberate, soft rhythm along the seam where drywall meets doorframe. I tried not to ascribe malice to the sound. Too many horror movies teach you to mirror panic in your very bones, but every time I filed it under house noises, the noise rearranged itself into a more specific accusation. On a night when the city outside was warm and the porch light hummed like a live thing, I was roused awake by a whisper that was not quite air. It threaded along the hallway, close to the floor, as if whoever made it had decided to keep company with the carpet. I lay still and listened, and what I heard was a syllable too round to be random, an almost word that could have been mine, or keep, or go, but which dissolved into static before it allowed meaning. The sound slotted into my dreams like gravel down a drain. I woke with the taste of iron on my tongue and the sensation that some attention had dipped into the room and lingered just outside the fragile boundary of sleep. When Ethan asked me quietly, over coffee, whether anyone else had inhabited his small room since Lucas moved out for grad school, his voice had the edge of someone arrangement cannot comfort. "I heard something in there," he said, hands curling the ceramics into their own small circle of heat. "Like someone breathing in the vents. Like a person who forgot how to leave." I told him what I'd told myself, old houses remember people, but that phrase offered the same flimsy consolation as a bandage on a deep cut. The closet door's slide had always stuck in the same way Lucas said it did. Lucas joked about ghosts the way people do when they crave a narrative for the creaks. But stories shift when new breath takes them up. "It's probably nothing," I said, and I meant it in the way people sometimes mean their own words in order to make them true. We turned the subject to bills and to the looming midterm schedule like two sailors trying to find a lighter conversation that might keep the hull of our ordinary life afloat. That week, Ethan found strange marks on the underside of his bed frame, small, parallel furrows like the tracks of some soft-toed tool, so faint I would have missed them if I hadn't been looking for reassurance. He laughed it off the way you laugh to remove tremor from a voice. "Must be mice," he said, and yet when he closed the door at night, there was a different weight to it, a carefulness that made me think he was counting rooms. A pattern tightened itself into less forgivable proofs. My phone began to collect photos I didn't take, a picture saved at 3:07 a.m. of my own bedroom, an angle from the doorway that captured my sleeping form, as if someone had stood in a place with a camera raised and waited for a breath to betray me. In that captured frame, the darkness in the doorway had a verticality that asserted itself with the insistence of human posture, tall, just shy of the frame, refusing to resolve into features. Metadata insisted the camera app had been active on my phone then and that no signal had left it to some cloud or remote. I showed Ethan the image the next morning in lame, hoping expression that asked for pragmatic explanation and was met with a look I could not quite read. He said the thing people say when they want to let fear shrink into the shape of consent: "Don't open it." He told me not to study the grain because the more I looked, the more the picture would seem to mean. He made it sound like a promise and a threat. That was when the fracturing between curiosity and survival began. Curiosity wants to know, survival wants to stay whole, and I found myself in a room where both were roaring at once like the two sides of a storm. We tried the weapons of modern common sense. We installed motion-activated lights in the hallway. We set up a cheap camera aimed at Ethan's door and another in the living room like digital talismans. We began sleeping in shifts as if occupancy would discourage the attention. One night we sat up late and watched footage on a laptop, fast-forwarding and rewinding the sleep hours into a blur. The recording was bored with ordinary life: empty couches, a cat jumping onto a window ledge, a pigeon pecking at a trash bag outside, until we reached the small, impossible window between 3:10 and 3:15 a.m. There, between frames, the camera returned an image that refused to resolve, not a human, not static, but a long vertical absence that hung with the gravity of a person. If you froze the frame and enlarged it, the pixels refused to build a face. The best the software did was render a posture, a tilt of head, the way shoulders slope when someone listens. We watched the file over and over until the room felt like a throat clenched in someone else's sleep, until the edges of the pixels seemed to vibrate with accusation. "This can't be right," Kyle said, ever the rational one, but his voice had an easy tremor I recognized because it matched my own. After that footage, there was a new etiquette in the apartment: don't open the closet at night, don't point cameras at doorways, don't let late-night friends crash on couches you can't keep an eye on. We invented small rules to fend off the sense that our home had become porous. Ethan started leaving his closet open a crack during the day as if argument had changed places with caution. I slept with a lamp on more nights than not. The rituals kept fear in the corners but didn't remove it. One evening, having promised myself I would be brave, I opened the closet in daylight and ran my hand along the hanging rod to see if I could find evidence of tampering, of some mechanism that could explain the noises and the movement. Inside, behind a row of shirts, I found a Polaroid tucked flat against the back wall, an old image of the room but not at any angle I'd ever taken it, a grainy, faded square that showed the space as if from inside the wall, and in its center a shadowed figure caught mid-turn. It wasn't Ethan, it wasn't Lucas, it wasn't anyone I recognized. The back of the Polaroid had a date in a handwriting that wasn't mine, 18 years ago. The discovery had the particular chill of a thing time-stamped to memory, and for the first time I felt that the apartment didn't just keep vestiges of people who had lived there, sometimes it kept the people themselves. We brought up the issue with the landlord in a careful, almost embarrassed way, as if we were bringing an old stain to his attention. He listened and told us the building had a history of squatters, of tenants that refused to leave rooms, but he shrugged off the more spectral implications with a wave that suggested bureaucracy was simpler than haunted. He recommended a locksmith, who came and checked the closets and the vents and the seams around the doors and left us with a receipt and a shrug of his own, nothing structural, he said. But the locksmith's tools did not touch what we could feel, which was attention. They could not replace the way our house had begun to collect eyes. Night kept arriving and with it the small, private claim on our rooms. I began waking up with the sensation of being watched from the corner between the closet and the door even when the camera showed nothing. I found myself speaking names aloud in the dark, Lucas, Ethan, anyone, like an incantation that might keep a presence named and therefore accessible to ordinary solutions. The speaking did nothing but remind me that names are poor shields for things that existed half a life ago. The escalation was not violent so much as structural, it rearranged the cadence of normal living until you could no longer tell where fear began and the house ended. Ethan, who had seemed so composed when he moved in, began to look hollowed out by the end of the semester. He ate less, he kept conversation short, he began to leave sticky notes on the inside of his closet door, small, hand-printed reminders to himself to breathe, to check the lock, to say the time out loud. Once, in a rare moment of trust, he showed me a note tucked behind his dresser that read, in pale ink, "Do not look when it leans, it does not like to be watched." The words were childish in the way adults sometimes write when they are trying to convince themselves of sanity. I wished for either more amenable evidence or for the simplicity of a prank, but neither arrived. Instead, one night, around 3 in the morning, the hour that had become a hub of small horrors, I woke to the sound of my own name whispered like a key being tested in a lock. It was sound that shaped itself into syllables in the exact place my name would be spoken if someone were familiar with me but not close enough to speak plainly. I sat up and the room was there, lamp, curtains, the faint rectangle where moonlight bled through the blinds. The doorway held a dark that felt like posture, and for a tremulous second I convinced myself someone stood there, listening for whether I would run or stay. We broke the lease the following month, because there are costs you can bear and costs that rearrange the way you measure your life. Moving is a practical thing, boxes, backaches, the bitter comedy of trying to find pizza in a city that has forgotten you, but leaving behind a room that has claimed itself is complicated in a way that no moving truck can fix. I took the Polaroid from the closet back to my car and slid it under the seat like evidence of a crime without a suspect. It sat there for months until one morning I found it gone, as if it had decided to continue its life without my permission. Ethan left without fanfare the night before registration week, his suitcase gone, his closet empty but for a single shirt hung backwards on a wire hanger. On the table, a note, "Thank you for the door." That line, brief and enigmatic, became the last punctuation to a chapter that refused to end with sense. In the apartment that remained, the small, attentive sounds continued for a while, like a habit that needed practice, and then, gradually, the way almost anything that persists without blood does, those noises slackened. I do not think they vanished, I think they waited for new ears, new sleep patterns to map themselves against the wood. Months later, in another city where the streets carry different names and the trees lean a different way in winter, I find myself careful with the rhythms of my evenings. I keep a lamp in the hallway that I leave lit until the last possible moment. I do not sleep with the closet door completely closed if a new roommate moves in. I take Polaroids sometimes, but I turn them face down before I leave the room to check for any signs I might have missed. There is a chastening in the lesson the room taught me, an instruction about attention that feels like an old country proverb: look too closely at the places where people have lived, and you invite the past to line up with the present. I tell this story because it is not dramatic in the way you expect, no chase, no bloody reveal, but it has a terror that is quiet and patient, the kind of dread that eats at the edges of sleep and leaves you with trembling hands in the morning. If you have rooms filled with other people's things, if you have closets that stick and vents that whisper, be gentle when you enter. Some houses keep people the way jars keep preserved fruit. Their faces soften, their edges blur, and if you are careless, you might find you have moved into a life already arranged by someone else's quiet needs. Some nights a city hums like a machine with too many cogs and too few brakes, and Portland, wet, honest, and somehow always 3 minutes behind the weather, has that hum built into its bones. My name is Adam, and Story 4 begins on a damp September evening when the idea of moving to the West Coast felt like a clean page and the reality of rent splitting felt like ledger lines you learned to memorize. And I had no reason to believe the apartment we signed for would teach me how small a person can feel when the room itself refuses to be empty. The loft sat above a converted textile factory, big windows, exposed brick, the kind of place that makes your friends call you aesthetic and your landlord apologize for a draft. The ad promised character, which, in the polite language of rentals, is always a heads up that the building will cough at inconvenient hours. I met Rylan in the lobby under fluorescent light, a film student with a stack of battered cameras and a manner that suggested he'd been rehearsing calm for years. He smiled with a shuttered sort of kindness, handled his belongings like relics, and told me the usual things people tell roommates: quiet hours, utility split, no strangers sleeping on the couch, then added, almost as an afterthought, that he liked to keep his mirrors turned away at night because reflections disturbed his sleep. It read as an artistly quirk until the day I found the first Polaroid. The Polaroid was tucked behind a set of Rylan's prints, grainy night shots of fairies and neon and faces he'd caught looking away, and when I pulled it free I felt the paper cool in my fingers like something breathed on. It showed our living room from a strange angle, as if a camera had stood inside the closet and looked out. The furniture sat where it always had, and in the middle of the frame there was the indistinct suggestion of a person, blurred where a face should be and taller than any of us. A dark column anchored in the photograph's center like a punctuation mark. Someone had dated the back in a handwriting not mine, 1999. I laughed to keep the cold down, because laughter is cheap and covering, but the joke slid off the surface. That same week, small changes began to collect into a language: keys placed on the wrong hook, a water glass left at the sink though I knew neither of us had drunk from it since morning, a faint ring of dust in the hallway precisely where the footsteps, later would pause. The apartment rearranged elements of ordinary living into proofs that someone, something, was practicing possession not by force but by patience. Rylan told me, eventually, in the soft deliberate pauses of a man who measures his sentences like exposures, when I moved here, I thought I was escaping a pattern, not carrying it. He told me that before Portland he'd lived in a small house outside Tacoma where a tenant vanished one winter and no one could make sense of where he'd gone. At the time the house had only given off polite sounds, creaks and settling, until the kitchen drawer opened at 3 in the morning and a line of pebbles sat in a circle on the counter. I thought it was grief, Rylan admitted, voice low, or the landlord's way of remembering, until it moved with me. The way he said it suggested more than superstition, it suggested an intimacy with a thing that knew how to wait. I tried to be practical, I bought motion sensors, I set up a cheap camera facing the corridor. The camera's timestamps were competent and cruel. Every night between 3:10 and 3:15 the footage would contain a single frame that refused to develop resolution, an absence thick enough you could almost give it shoulders. Software could not resolve it because there was nothing there to resolve into a human face, merely the posture and the insistence of presence. When I showed the clips to friends they blinked and assigned logic, compression artifact, infrared bloom. They were wrong. Logic leaves margins that do not bruise like those margins did. The apartment learned to adapt in small, precise increments. Footsteps would begin on the section of ceiling above Rylan's room and move with a calculated slowness, pausing where the closet sat sealed and still, like a visitor testing whether the bed was still warm in some long-forgotten way. In the hallway a ring of dust would appear that matched the cadence above, once, a line of pebbles, smooth, river stones, laid in an arrow pointing at the closet door as if someone had been mapping routes through the dark for a long journey. Objects shifted in manners that were not violent but were meticulous. A mug nudged an inch closer to the sink, shoes turned to face a wall, a lamp's cord laid in a tidy loop on the floor at dawn. The changes were not random, they announced themselves like a teacher tapping the chalkboard. Pay attention. That attention, practiced over nights and seasons, taught me how small my choices looked when a room learned to prefer a certain arrangement. There were nights I tried to catalog the thing in spreadsheets, the modern art of denial, notes for times, sensors that logged entries, charts for temperature fluctuations. All of it returned to the same cluster, a set of correlated anomalies that converged around 3 a.m. every few nights, like a clock striking an hour it had chosen for itself. The landlord told us it was an old building, that sounds happen, that sometimes former tenants leave marks. The locksmith checked the closet door and found nothing structurally wrong. The university counselor supplied breathing exercises and vocabulary, anxiety, hypervigilance, the influence of sleep deprivation. Those remedies are honest and useful up to the point where the house invents a new grammar, a voice threaded through the plaster not in words at first, but as a tone you feel more than hear, like a violin string tuned too low. Then one night it learned how to speak. I woke at the sound of a crack like slow ice breaking. For a moment I thought it was the balcony railing giving out or a truck idling below, then the thought of such ordinary causes felt ridiculous. The sound rose from the ceiling above my bed in a long, deliberate scrape, followed by the distinct, human syllable of a voice shaped not in breath but in patient articulation. It said, too clearly for the hour, stay. Not a suggestion, a command turned to habit. My chest cavitated with cold and I couldn't raise my hands to reach for the lamp. Rylan was awake on his side, face pale and composed in a way that suggested resignation instead of shock. He admitted we'd been on borrowed time and that the house collected more than furniture, sometimes it collected the pattern of a life and kept it close. Saying it aloud made the room into a document, the document then had witnesses. We did what people frequently do, we tried small rebellions. We slept in the living room together for a week, lights on, the laptop screen a thin moon. We taped over mirrors, we turned Polaroids face down. Rituals are a form of arithmetic. If you do enough small things, you hope they sum into safety, but the presence treated rituals like a practice drill and, if anything, began to favor nights when we varied our defenses. Rylan's history with the house layered like old film stock. He found in an old junk drawer a ticket stub from a ferry, a parking paid envelope stamped with a date years before we were born, and in the back of the closet another Polaroid, this one of a man sleeping in a chair, face blurred but posture familiar. The handwriting on the back, small, impatient, read like an inventory, stayed too long. These were not mere ghost stories traded over coffee. They were evidence assembled into a narrative that suggested a culture of attention had taken root inside the apartment, a person had been present, then absent, then replaced by a habit that resisted being evicted. I dreamed the sound of footsteps for nights, waking at odd minutes to the sensation of pressure in the air. My friends treated me like a subject in a story they didn't want to believe. Maybe it's the pipes, man, maybe you need sleep. They were trying to protect me from panic by offering me commands anyone could follow. Panic is not prophylactic, panic only asks you to notice how small your hands look when you have to pack to leave. The intrusions escalated with a peculiar intelligence. One afternoon I found a line of coins, lost quarters, smooth with use, arranged from the kettle to the closet, ending with a single pebble in the center of the hallway. Another time we woke to find every clock in the apartment set 3 minutes slow. A camera left on the tripod recorded a noon full of ordinary motion and then, inexplicably, one frame at 3:13 a.m. with a vertical darkness in the doorway that the footage could not translate into a face. There were nights I sat and watched the feed until the pixels made me dizzy, searching for a moment that would humanize what was going on and never finding it. You begin to learn small truths about fear when it is your domestic companion. It's best to move with practical calm, keep your speech small, and if you can, carry humor that bends to practicality. I learned to joke about everything in a way that kept me from turning into a man whose life was catalogued by the thump of floorboards. The last week we spent in that loft collapsed the pretense of ordinary living with an elegance that was crueler than panic. The steps above Ryland's room grew faster, no longer the measured pacing of a bored thing, but bursts that suggested impatience. The voice tested longer words and then returned to monosyllables. On a night when the power blinked and went soft as an option key on a keyboard, the voice threaded through a seam in the ceiling and formed two words so clear my teeth hurt from the pressure the sound placed in my jaw: still here. We moved instinctively, not toward the exit but toward witness. Ryland had his camera and pointed it at the closet door as if documentation could make a legal case of a haunting. The camera hung between us like a talisman. For a long terrifying minute the apartment breathed and then contracted, the closet door pushed inward like something testing its margin and then, in a motion so slow it felt premeditated. The lock clicked and the door swung open an inch to reveal nothing but the same dim, dry air, except inside a rectangle of lighter dust in the middle indicated something had once been pressed there, like a pillow left on a bed and smoothed over. A photograph lay on the floor inside. We hadn't seen that photograph before, but when Ryland picked it up the image made our stomachs clench. It was our living room, shot from the closet, and there in the center sat the same tall blur we had seen on older Polaroids, only this time the blur had the sense of being turned slightly toward the camera, like something aware it had been captured. The back of the print had a date written in the scrawl of someone who didn't expect readers, a winter 10 years earlier. That the room had kept a dated mark like a catalog entry felt less creepy than it felt bureaucratic, an office keeping minutes on its own occupants. We left then, the way people leave when the cost of staying becomes the shrunken life defined by constant scanning for footprints. Moving is a logistical operation and grief masquerading as action. You box things and you tell yourself that physical distance is a remedy. The landlord later called and said he'd found the closet unlocked a week after we'd given the keys back, and that his crew had sealed it again. He told me over the phone, in the polite, distanced voice of a man employed to maintain property lines, that there were footprints in the dust and one small pebble in the corner, black and worn smooth like a river stone. He offered the usual, "Sorry, old building problems, we'll seal it better next time." Words are a kind of repair job until the thing you're repairing still hears you. I sometimes imagine the pebble there under the dust like a marker that says, quietly, "This place keeps counts." Sometimes I imagine it gone and wonder if something else took it with the care with which it had arranged our lives for that season. It is not a tidy lesson I take from that apartment. There is no courtroom revelation, no climactic exorcism, no final line that ties the story into something neat for feeding to listeners who like their terror solved. What I carry are small instructions learned the expensive way: keep a light on longer than is reasonable, leave a camera pointed not for spectacle but for safety, tape a Polaroid face down if you must take one and put it in a wallet until you can decide whether to remember or forget. The thing that haunted the Portland loft did not scream or batter us, it practiced patience and learned our rhythms until we felt smaller by habit. Rooms remember more than bodies do, they remember attention, the small routines that make a person inhabit a place. If you move into a room where the closet is oddly cold, where a pebble appears in the center of the hallway without provenance, where the ceiling sounds like footsteps at an hour the world assumes is private, be kind to yourself. You're not paranoid, you're just awake enough to listen. And sometimes listening is the only defense you have left. Some houses in American suburbs wear their history like a tired coat, frayed at the edges, patched in places where someone tried to fix what could not be mended, and the little split level I moved into on the edge of Denver felt like one of those coats from the first time I stepped across its threshold. My name is Adam, and Story 5 began the winter I was 24 and thought my life would be saved by proximity to campus and cheap rent, not by the way two strangers across a hallway kept. Glances that suggested they were cataloging me for reasons I did not yet understand, because sometimes the scariest thing a place can teach you is how to be watched by people who are already watched by something else. The house itself had a dated charm, paneling that had been varnished an extra time, a shallow living room bay that gathered lamplight, and stairs that made the kind of creaks you only notice when you are young and trying to sleep. But those domestic quirks were the easy part. The hard part was the residence I moved in with, Claire, a practical nurse with hands that always smelled faintly of antiseptic and a laugh that closed too quickly, and Mason, who owned the kind of silence that fills rooms because it is waiting for permission to speak. They took me in because the numbers added up, utilities shared, rent divided, a spare bedroom that cost enough less than a studio to justify it. I signed the lease while the landlord smiled and said, "It's a good neighborhood," and nobody thought to tell me the house was a place that kept attention the way some people keep heirlooms, not by possession but by practice. From the first nights I noticed the house had a schedule that was not entirely its own, small acoustic rituals that happened after midnight like a clock kept by someone who preferred the hours when the city quieted, a single footstep on the stairs at 1:03 a.m., a faint scrape near the baseboard at 2:11. And a soft, indistinct exhale of motion over the landing at 3:13 that felt as patient and reliable as a calendar. Claire called those times, the hours, like a nurse might measure shifts, practical, clinical, meant to shrink worry, but Mason used other words. He said the house had a visitor that likes the landing. I laughed at the phrasing at first because the clean answer is always cheaper than the real one, but when your roommates make coordinated effort to avoid a place in their own home, you notice. The very geometry of how we moved inside those walls shifted. We circled the landing like people who avoid an icy patch on a sidewalk, rearranged our nights to avoid footsteps that sounded like a slow apology, and left lights on in corners long after we had reason to. The thing about adaptations is that they are small at first, benign enough to pass as habit, and then one morning you realize your whole life has tilted in response to a noise that will not explain itself. The first real sign that the house was something more than an eccentric landlord's problem came in the way. It taught itself to speak in small verbs that tugged on ordinary things, mugs placed with handles all facing the same way, shoes lined up in petty military formation, a chair nudged so it blocked a bedroom door enough to make it annoying but not impossible to use, as if practice were a language taught with objects instead of words. One Wednesday I came back from classes and found the kitchen radio set to a station I'd never heard, static under the music like someone trying to listen between songs. The calendar on the fridge showed a day circled in pencil I did not recognize, and in the hallway under the stairs there was a small, polished pebble sitting directly in the middle of the carpet as if someone had wanted to mark the spot they favored. Claire saw it too, and her hand tightened around her coffee mug the way a surgeon's fingers tighten around a scalpel. She told me, without the melodrama of someone looking for ghosts, that the house developed routines around people, learned how they moved, and sometimes refused to give them up. Mason, who had been less talkative since the night he first saw the pebble, added quietly that when he moved in he found a single footprint pressed into the hallway pad, too deep, he said, to be from any shoe he recognized. He described its edges like a scientist naming a specimen. When I pressed for meaning he shrugged and said, "It counts us one at a time, and that kind of answer settles into your bones in a way that nothing else can." We tried modern measures first because modern measures are where the mind goes to feel safe, motion sensors, cameras, notes taped to doors, and bright bulbs left burning in the landing like lampposts in a storm. The cameras recorded what they wanted to record, mugs placed, the cat jumping to a windowsill, the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses down, and then sporadically, in the narrow window between 3 and 4 in the morning, they returned a frame that refused to be made sensible. A dark verticality in the center of the landing that the software would not translate into a face, but which, when we slowed the footage, suggested posture. An angle of shoulders slightly cocked, as though something learned what bodies looked like in the dark and practiced holding that shape without needing features. Each time we reviewed the clip the same way, fast forward, slow down, freeze on the frame, the hair on our arms lifted. People in the city have a rational explanation for everything, but rationality does not fill in the cracks left by a non-answer that looks like attention. We replaced batteries, moved cameras, and even tried to stay awake for one entire night, 2, then 3. For a while courage looked like caffeine and the willingness to watch pixels until they blurred. But bravery is a finite resource, and at 3:13 the house did something new. It spoke a single word across the landing, low and patient and shaped by someone who had learned to keep the syllable for years: stay. The word was not shouted, nor spoken with malice. It carried the terrible politeness of a claim, the idea you can have a place without being granted permission, and after it hung there between us like the cooled residue of a gasp we simultaneously exhaled and swallowed. Our domestic logic began to unravel in ways both practical and intimate. Claire started bringing a fold-up chair and sitting with me in the living room after midnight, not to be brave but to record company. Humans generate different air than whatever lived at the landing, she said. Mason, whose hands had always been neat and precise, began to mark the edges of the rug where the pebble had been, tracing the footprint we'd found months earlier and measuring its depth like a man trying to keep the world from changing without permission. Meanwhile, the house escalated its choreography. The pebble moved a few inches one morning and 2 inches the next, our shoes drifted a degree further from the door each night, and there was a photograph left on the staircase one dawn, face down as if someone had decided we should not look yet. When we turned it over together, the glossy paper held an image of the landing with the same dark verticality standing at the center, looking toward a camera that had apparently stood inside the closet at some earlier, unrecorded time. On the back of the print a date was scribbled, years before any of us had been born, and a single, clear word, arrived. The thing the house had learned and practiced was not an obvious malice, it was a slow education in possession, a pedagogy of small claims that altered how we moved through the day and how we thought about leaving. As the nights folded, our rituals multiplied, we left lights on in different patterns, we placed tamper-resistant tape across closet seams. We made a schedule to sleep in different rooms to disrupt its counting. For a few weeks I believed that busying ourselves might be a cure, because action is always a kind of antidote to helplessness, but the house proved adaptive. It shifted its hours, changed the exact phrase of its voice to make it more intimate, where once it said, "Stay," one night it said, softly, "Don't go back," as if it had learned the grammar of restriction, and that particular phrasing did something more precarious than scare us. It put a plan inside the sound and suggested that movement away from the house would not necessarily end the relationship we had unwillingly begun. I started dreaming of the landing, of footsteps that made polygons across my ceiling, of a pebble caught on my tongue like a coin I could not swallow. Dreams present you with the small hard facts that the day avoids, that presence remembers you even when you believe you have been careful. The final week in that house was an accumulation, small, deliberate escalations that formed a choreography of sophistication and cruelty. One night all the clocks in the living room stopped at the same minute, 3:13, then restarted with a tiny tick that felt like laughter. Another night, a photograph I'd taken of the back porch developed a faint imprint in the center, a shadow taller than Mason and wider than Claire, leaning as if to listen, and on the penultimate night something happened we still do not understand except as evidence. The footprint in the middle of the landing had deepened as if a weight had been pressed there for hours, and around it a ring of dust was arranged into a careful spiral like a slow spiral staircase drawn on the floor with fingertips. It was the sight of that spiral that made everything practical and all at once useless, when a pattern is carved out where you thought the floor was neutral. The only intelligent response is to leave, because the ways of the house have overtaken the ways of people. We packed with hands that trembled not from fear alone, but from the strange grief of being evicted by something that had never signed the lease. I remember carrying boxes to my car and looking back through the window at the landing where the pebble lay like a black eye, ignorant and watchful, and feeling suddenly small in a way textbooks had not prepared me for. We left in a hurry before dawn and did not lock a single door, not knowing whether leaving quietly would be kinder to the thing than the chaos of slamming trunks and shouted farewells. The landlord called within a week, voice brittle and unpracticed in the language of dismay, to say when his maintenance man checked the unit he found the landing carpet with a new deep depression, exactly where the footprint had been, as if someone had knelt there and pressed their palm into the weave for a very long time, and next to it a pebble placed perfectly in the center of the circle. He asked if anyone wanted their stuff kept on hold. None of us claimed anything that felt salvageable against memory. The imprint remained to be discovered by the next tenant who would, depending on their tolerance and history, either shrug and move in or notice and leave. Either outcome felt like a mercy and a sentence. I tell you this last story not because it concludes elegantly, because it does not, but because there is a lesson in the small domestic terrors that outlast spectacle. Rooms remember attention, and attention can be taught to prefer certain bodies and certain times. It learns and it waits. If you ever move into a place that smells faintly of someone else's life, if you find objects set in patterns that feel too deliberate, or if you wake at 3:13 in the morning to the sense of being counted, do not think of yourself as dramatic for listening, think of yourself as awake. Practical things help. Keep a light on a little longer than you think necessary, mark the edges of carpets and rugs. Photograph corners at daylight and tuck those photos away if they unsettle you, and always leave a little room in your plans for the fact that some houses do not end when you end them, they trail their habits. The house I left in Denver did not throw us out with screaming or violence, it taught us ways to keep small, to minimize, to sleep in shifts and leave lights on. Perhaps that is cruelty in the softest costume, perhaps that is mercy in the only tongue it understands. Some places in America feel temporary by design, like the sort of cities you pass through on a layover but never mean to stay in, and yet people do stay. They gather in cheap apartments and shared houses and call it, for now, until, for now, turns into the way their life sounds. My name is Adam, and the winter I lived in a skinny, crooked rental outside Atlanta. I thought all I was signing up for was a short commute and a roommate who paid rent on time, but it turned into something else entirely. A lesson in what it means when a third roommate is always talked about, always prepared for, always accommodated in the way the furniture stands and the dishes are counted, but somehow never actually appears when the lights are on. The landlord called it a 3-bedroom opportunity, in an email, like it was a job posting. The house was a sagging one-story just off a busy road line with fast food lights and gas stations, the kind of strip that never really gets dark. I moved in because I was tired of long drives and tired of dorm noise, and the ad made it sound simple. One resident already living there, another room rented but occupant, barely home, third room available for me if I didn't mind a place with character. People use that word for all kinds of sins. I told myself I understood that, I didn't. My first impression of the house was that it had been filled a little too carefully. The living room was furnished with just enough: sofa, coffee table, a lamp whose shade had clearly belonged to a different decade, but none of it felt true to the person who greeted me at the door. His name was Trevor, a software guy who worked remotely and wore the kind of t-shirt that never gets wrinkled because it rarely sees the outside air. He apologized for the boxes in the hallway, explained they belonged to the other roommate, and spoke about that third person the way people talk about relatives who are always about to arrive. He's on nights right now, he'll probably be sleeping. When you get here, you won't see him much, but he's chill. The third bedroom door at the end of the hall stayed shut during the whole tour, and when I asked if we should knock and say hi, Trevor's answer came too quick: "Nah, he hates being woken up, trust me," followed by a laugh that landed a little wrong. I let it pass because my mind was busy tallying square footage and the distance to campus, busy finding reasons to say yes to a rent split that finally made my budget feel breathable. The first week was ordinary in the way most dangerous things are at the beginning. I woke to the sound of traffic instead of fire alarms for once. I went to class, I came home. Trevor worked in his corner of the living room with a headset on, tapping quietly at his keyboard, and the house seemed to settle around our two shapes like it knew how to hold exactly that much weight. At night, though, there were hints that the space had been set for 3. Every morning there were 3 coffee cups left out on the counter to dry, even when I remembered only seeing Trevor make one. There were 3 towels hanging in the bathroom, one still slightly damp at 11 at night when I brushed my teeth for the last time. The toilet seat would sometimes be left up in a way that didn't match either of our habits, and someone kept putting the thermostat back to a number I never chose. I'd mention it casually and Trevor would shrug: "Yeah, that's probably Ben. He's on that 12-hour shift schedule, you know. Doesn't really cross paths with anybody." The way he said it made it sound less like a schedule and more like a rule. I tried to meet this Ben the way you try to meet any ghost knowledge in a house, in practical increments. I made a point of hanging around the kitchen late, dishes in my hand, just in case he walked in. I left my door open in the morning while I packed my bag, listening for movement in the hallway. I watched for extra shoes by the door. There was always evidence: a pair of worn boots by the mat that I never saw Trevor wear, a heavy gray hoodie draped over the back of a chair, a bottle of cheap cologne in the bathroom that didn't match his clean, unscented soap. Once, when I got up around 2 in the morning to get water, I heard the unmistakable sounds of someone in the kitchen ahead of me: the click of the fridge door, the muted clink of a glass on the counter, a quiet, rough cough like someone clearing their throat after a long shift. The light under the door glowed soft yellow. I put my hand on the knob, ready to finally say hello, and then, for no good reason I can explain, I stopped and waited. The sounds continued for a few seconds and then cut off all at once, not with the trailing hush of someone walking away, but like a recording being stopped. When I opened the door, the kitchen was empty. The fridge was closed, the glass I'd left drying before bed was still upside down on the towel where I'd put it. But the room smelled faintly of cheap coffee and sweat and the cold air you only really taste when someone has just walked in from outside. It might have stayed at the level of a weird housemate situation, if not for the way Trevor became overprotective about that back bedroom. In most share houses, doors come and go, whether intentionally or not, people forget to close them, drafts open them, roommates poke their heads in to borrow something. This door never moved, I never saw it ajar, not even by an inch. When I passed it at night, the gap under it stayed completely black, no light leaking out, no sound slipping through besides the house's own tired breathing. Once, rushing to class with half a bagel in my hand, I collided with Trevor in the hall right in front of it. His reaction was instantaneous. One hand shot out to brace the knob as if my bump might have forced it open. We both laughed it off, but that laugh did not feel shared. It felt like a password he was saying to himself to keep from losing something. Later, when I brought it up sideways, "So, Ben really never comes out?" Trevor said that he'd been through some stuff, that he liked his privacy, that this house is the only place that still feels like his. That last sentence sat in the air between us long after the conversation had moved on. As weeks turned into months, the house began to feel like a loop. Every night at almost the exact same time, the same sequence, the faint sound of keys at the front door without my ever seeing it open, the quiet rush of water in the pipes leading to the hall bathroom, a shadow passing under my door that was the wrong shape to be Trevor's, the weight of another person out in the hall when I held my breath and listened. More than once, my bedroom doorknob rattled, gently, like someone testing whether they'd locked their own room by mistake. I asked Trevor again and again whether Ben was okay, whether we should maybe all just sit down and talk sometime, but he brushed it off, always with the same cool, deflecting gentleness. "He's okay when he's on his routine," he'd say. "If you try to change it, he's not." I noticed that every time he mentioned the routine, his eyes flicked toward my door like he was checking to see if it had shifted even a millimeter. I might have gone on pretending forever if it hadn't been for the photographs. One rainy Sunday when my car wouldn't start and the day felt stalled in the wrong gear, I ended up helping Trevor dig through a plastic storage bin in the living room, looking for a spare cable he swore he had. Under a tangle of wires and old notebooks, I found a thick envelope of printed photos, the cheap glossy kind you get from a drugstore kiosk. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect, housewarming shots, people holding red cups on this same sagging couch, faces I didn't recognize grinning into the lens under a too bright flash. But in almost every picture, the composition was the same, two guys in the foreground, Trevor and someone else, and a third man either half cut off at the edge or caught in the background mirror, tall, dark-haired, heavier around the shoulders, always turned slightly away from the camera like he'd moved at the last second. In one frame the three of them stood in front of the house, sunlight bright enough to wash out the peeling paint, and I finally saw him clearly, the missing roommate, looking right at the lens, eyes dark in a way that seemed more tired than unkind. On the back, in a scrawl I hadn't yet seen on any envelope in the house, someone had written, "Ben's place now, we made it." The date was 3 years earlier. I'm not proud of how I confronted him, fear rarely makes a person elegant. That night, when the house felt swollen with storm air and the sound of tires on wet pavement seeped through the walls, I dropped the stack of photos on the coffee table in front of Trevor and asked, "Where is he really?" Because I've never actually seen him home and awake, not once. For a second, something like hope flashed in his face, which was not the reaction I'd expected. Then his expression collapsed into something more complicated. He rubbed his thumb over Ben's face in the front picture, the one of them in front of the house, and said, "He's here. He just doesn't always know how to be anymore." I started to push, asked whether he'd moved out, whether he was in trouble, whether we should call someone, but he cut me off quietly, in that careful voice you use when you're bringing a fragile thing out into the light. "He died," Trevor said. "Not here, not in this house, but he died, and this is still his room." The kind of silence that follows news like that is different from ordinary quiet, it has texture, like thick cloth thrown over the furniture of a conversation. He told me then, in bits and pieces, about the accident, a highway outside Macon on a night much like the one outside our window, rain turning road markings into blurred rivers of white, a semi that changed lanes without seeing the smaller car. He talked about the weeks between the funeral and this house, about how they'd moved here together on a plan that never had a chance to activate, about how, for a while, he'd felt ridiculous leaving Ben's shoes by the door and his hoodie on the chair, but it had made the evenings hurt less. He said that the first time he really believed something was different was when he woke up at 3 in the morning to the smell of that same cheap cologne in the hallway, strong and fresh, and heard footsteps he recognized on the warped floorboards. "It's not like in movies," he said. "It's not even like stories, it's routines." He just kept doing the things he always did when he worked nights: bathroom, kitchen, stand in the hall and think about nothing. After that confession, it became impossible to pretend the house was neutral. Knowing made the evidence sharper. Late at night, when I lay awake listening to the ordinary breathing of the house, the furnace ticking to life, the hum of the fridge, there was another layer under it, a pattern that didn't belong to either of us. I'd hear the bathroom door open and close when the light under my own door stayed unchanged. I'd hear the soft thump of someone sitting gingerly on the couch, the springs giving just a little underweight that didn't stay. Once, when I woke thirsty, I opened my door to find a faint line of wet footprints leading from the front door to the hall bath, water still soaking into the carpet, disappearing step by step before my eyes. There were 12 of them, same distance apart, same direction, and in the middle of the hall one of them was deeper, like the person had stopped there and shifted their weight, deciding whether to keep going. I told myself I wasn't afraid, only unsettled. Those are lies you tell yourself when the thing haunting you is the house's sense of loyalty instead of something overtly violent. But the line between those categories started to blur one night around midterms, when stress had made my sleep shallow and strange. I came home late from the library, the kind of late where your eyes burn and nothing feels quite real. Trevor's door was closed, the living room lights were off except for the faint glow of the cable box. As I passed the third bedroom, the one that was never open, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, like I'd walked past the open door of a walk-in freezer. My breath puffed in the air even though the rest of the house was warm. For the first time since moving in, the doorknob to Ben's room was not perfectly straight, it had turned slightly, as if someone inside had just taken their hand off it. I don't know why I did what I did next. Maybe I was tired of being half a person in my own house, tired of not being acknowledged by whatever shared it with us. I put my hand on the knob and said, very softly, "Ben. I live here too." The metal was cold, unpleasantly so. For a second nothing happened, the house held its breath in every wall. Then, on the other side of the door, as clear as if a living person stood with their head leaned against the wood, I heard a voice, low and rough at the edges, say, "I know." That was all. 2 words, but the way he said them rearranged something inside my chest. There was recognition in it, and exhaustion, and a strain I'd only ever heard in the voices of people who'd worked too many shifts in a row. After that, things changed. Not in huge ways. You don't get jump scares from a man whose life was built out of repetition, but in the small patterns that define whether a place feels like it's tolerating you or choosing you. The footsteps on the nights after that stopped pausing by my door. They walked from the front door to the bathroom and back, the way he had when the house only belonged to him and Trevor. The bathroom mirror stopped clouding over when I'd been lying in bed for hours already. The glasses on the counter stayed where I left them overnight. But the house still knew there were 3 of us, not 2. I woke one morning to find my backpack, which I'd left beside my bed, sitting neatly by the front door as if someone had placed it there for me the way they would for a roommate about to be late. On another day, my hoodie was hung on the back of the dining chair I always used, sleeve straightened, hood smoothed, faint trace of cheap cologne clinging to the fabric like an apologetic hand. It all might have settled into an uneasy truce if life outside hadn't kept moving. Semesters end, leases expire, people change plans. When I told Trevor in late April that I'd been accepted into a program states away and would be leaving at the end of the summer, the room went very quiet. He nodded, said he was happy for me, made all the right supportive noises, but that night the routines came back with an edge I hadn't heard before. The footsteps returned to my door, stopping right outside, the boards creaking under a weight that leaned in just a little too far. My doorknob rattled once, twice, then stilled. I lay there frozen, knowing what was on the other side wasn't flesh and bone the way it used to be, but feeling just as pinned as if it were. "I can't stay here forever," I whispered, not sure who I was talking to. From the hallway, the faintest reply came, muffled by wood and by distance and by whatever thinned-out state he lived in now, "Don't leave him alone." The words weren't accusation, they sounded like a man on another endless night shift, making a request he didn't expect to be honored. In the end, I did leave. You can love people you don't stay with, and you can respect houses you don't live in. I packed my boxes in August heat, sweat sticking my shirt to my back, Trevor carrying things to the car in tight, controlled trips that had more weight in them than the objects deserved. We didn't talk about Ben those last few days, not directly, but the night before I drove away, none of us slept much. It was one of those thick Georgia nights where even the crickets sound tired. Around 3 in the morning, lying awake on my mattress with most of my room already empty, I heard third-shift footsteps one last time. Front door, hallway, bathroom, hallway, pause at the middle where the floor always dipped. Then, for the first time since I'd moved in, the steps came down the hall toward my room and stopped right at the edge of my remaining things. The air grew colder around my packed boxes, not in a way that felt like threat, but like someone checking inventory. After a moment, the presence shifted away and returned to the landing. The house exhaled a tiny groan, wood contracting under the weight of a decision. I don't know what I expected as a final sign. There was no labeled message, no object placed in my hand, but as I carried the last box out the next morning, I glanced back down the hallway and saw that for the first time since I'd moved in, the third bedroom door wasn't perfectly shut, it was open by less than an inch, just enough to see that the room beyond was pale and empty, the bed unmade, the window shade half up. Trevor was standing at the kitchen sink, hands braced on either side, not looking down the hall. I didn't ask him if he'd opened it, he didn't ask me if I'd heard anything. There are some questions that don't really want answers, they want acknowledgement. I think about that house sometimes, when I'm in some new place with new roommates and the old routines start up again, someone leaving my coffee mug closer to the sink than I put it, a backpack moved to where it should be, a faint trace of cheap cologne on a jacket I haven't worn since that winter in Atlanta. I don't think Ben followed me, I think he belonged to that house the way some people belong to late nights, and narrow halls and the comfort of someone else breathing on the other side of a wall. What stayed with me was the shape of the way he tried, even in whatever form was left to him, to keep the rhythm going so Trevor wouldn't have to live in silence. Haunted isn't always the right word, sometimes it's just a place that remembers you so hard, it tries to keep being your roommate when you're already gone. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Tonight's tale fades softly, leaving its last light in the quiet corners of your mind. Let the echoes settle. Let the darkness rest. Good night.